Yeah, and I think sort of for the mathematicians here, I think the experiences you can often result in, by doing a lot of testing and analytics is a local max, whereas by sort of doing more artistic, intuitive kind of, solve for another local problem, you jump to the next mountain, which might be a higher mountain. And I think that's really what the test is. There's the creative art to sort of figuring out what the non-local max might be, and then a very analytic approach to getting to the local max on whatever hillside you've ended up on. So Laura, a lot of things you mentioned are talking about sort of how do you define the resources and the types of design. What do you think are the types of techniques and team resources you need between visual design or interaction design? What actually makes things good design? What's the team construct that you need to produce that?
Well, I want to talk just briefly about sort of that difference between interaction design and visual design first, because sure. I think that they both play a huge part in whether something is usable. But I think that I consider interaction design to be making a product that a user can use and understand. And visual design is often sort of seen as making a product pretty. But I think that they work really well together because, for example, take a call to action button. You can make it giant and red, and that would be a visual design decision. Or you could make it tiny and blue, and that would also be a visual design decision. But obviously, those also have huge implications for whether a user can find the call to action button. So that's really an interaction design question. So in terms of how you set up the teams to produce the right design or to come up with the right product, I think that interaction and visual design have to work very closely together. For me, my process has always been you nail down how a product works first. And it's not just that you then take that and make it pretty, but you nail down how you want a product to work, what features you want it to have, and how you want people to be able to solve their problems using the product. And then you have your visual design serve that purpose. So you use the visual design to then enhance that and to improve the interaction design, and always to work toward that goal of making the product easier to use. And also visual design can have a huge impact on that emotional response, the feeling of a product, whether somebody comes to a product and says, oh yeah, this is for me. This is my product, and within the first few seconds. So it has that plays a big role in adoption of your product.
So, Andrew, you have, I guess, coined the term minimum desirable product, or MDP, and you wrote a great blog post, I thought, on this maybe about a year ago or 6 months ago.
Yeah, thank you.
Wondering, and so again, for folks following at home, I think bit.ly/leandesign4 is a link to that blog post. Could you explain what you mean by minimum desirable product in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, so I think for the folks that are doing work, I think exclusively in consumer internet and want to build something big, there's this whole desire to build something that obviously reaches a big audience and first to 50 million unique users or something like that. And I think that when I started to think about how you approach that kind of a process, I think initially I spent a lot of time thinking about sort of the business side of things, right? So, how much money can you make, and how do you make it viral, and how do you build out your distribution models, and what's the smallest amount of product that you can build in order to validate, your business model. And I think, as time evolved, I started to think, hey, I think as far as consumer internet is concerned, very exclusively kind of think sort of scope to that market type. It's really about how much value can you create for people, and then sort of the optimization comes in, sort of kicks in as a second leg of that. And so I started talking about and thinking about the notion of desirability as IDEO having a framework that's like there's desirability, which is all about just creating value for users and design and all of that stuff, and then there's viability, which is around business models, and then feasibility, which is around kind of proving out your technology, and that a lot of consumer internet these days is very much about desirability. And so rather than kind of prioritizing first and foremost, like how do you actually make money on the thing, that for the folks that are wanting to build, the next Facebook or Twitter or whatever, it's really about how much value can you create for people first and foremost, and then the other two things are kind of like the more commodity, parts of the business.
How do you deal with the fact that sometimes there is a zero-sum game you're playing between user happiness and business value?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think it depends on how long-term you're being, right, and how much money, how much funding you have, and all of these things, right? You look at the companies that are obviously shooting really, really big, and they basically don't really think about their business model for many years in. And if you can put yourself in that position, then great. I think for the folks that want to build a revenue kind of sustainable business very, very quickly, then obviously you're going to put more of a filter from a viability standpoint. So I think it has a lot to do with just the entrepreneur's goals. It's very situational.
If someone could flip back to the screen here real quick, I want to show one other post, which is guaranteed to offend. So another post that I wrote a while back, which created quite a bit of controversy, was one called The Faces, it's all about the motherfucking faces, or avatars, icons, and big butts. This image in particular got me no fans among the feminist community. And I'm putting Rashmi on the spot here a little bit as a female founder and CEO. The point I was trying to make was that very many social networking companies, and I was sort of using LinkedIn as the example, don't really emphasize the social elements of their social platform, and that a lot of human genetics evolution are really tied around our responses to things which are hardwired, in particular pornography, genitalia, and faces. The faces part of that conversation is actually for public consumption, although I challenge you to at least address the other parts of that as well. So Rashmi, I know you read that post and we're in the middle of that. I didn't earn necessarily some fans from Allison Capon and other people. What's your thoughts around sort of using visual elements and other calls to action in design for your startup?
I mean, but of course. I have a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. A huge part of the brain, I know that a huge part of the brain is devoted to the processing of visual stimuli. Of course, it makes sense, but I think you have to step back and also think about when instead of having 50 names on a page, you have the stream with 50 faces. Then you've made the page a lot more cluttered as well. So you have to balance that. But otherwise, absolutely, and I think something that to be noticed about the consumer web now is that you do see faces everywhere, and big faces, and you recognize people visually. So.
And you guys ran some experiments where you were doing sort of call to action visual overlays on slides. I think YouTube pioneered a lot of the use of sort of call to action UI right on top of a visual presentation or a video in their case. You guys did it for slides. How did that kind of did that make any difference in your product design, and how was that relative to other things that you were trying to optimize for?
So those experiments have gone really, really well. We've been able to just bring up, crazy amount of click-throughs for those calls to actions right on the slides. In terms of the relatives, I mean, the moment you start optimizing for a particular metric, of course, everything else starts to go down, and that's where you have to carefully balance the two. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's maybe what Siki was talking about before, is there's a bias towards certain measurability. Things that are measurable tend to be the things you optimize for, and I wonder if, was that in opposition or alignment to your overall business goals? Obviously, you got people to click on those slide presentations or maximize session behavior. Did that actually achieve business goals as well, or was that just achieving a very tactical goal?
So, you always do have to balance that. So recently we made some design changes which increased time on site for the average user by about a minute, which is huge for a big site like SlideShare to be able to, in one move, one day, you suddenly increase time on site by a minute. But it reduced the virality. So the people were interacting with the viral tools a lot less. And at that point, we really did have a decision to make, and we actually chose to tone down because we already have great engagement. For us, at that point of time, virality was more important.
Right. Siki, could you talk a little bit about what, in your opinion, when you're just, I guess you're part of Zynga now, a lot of their process is, design studio, game design. How do you get started with that process? What's sort of best practices emerging at Zynga for the minimum team construct when you're trying to get this stuff off the ground? And what's their process for beginning, quote, a design of a new game or a new application?
Sure. So I joined Zynga a little bit before, actually, 2 months before the new game launch, Treasure Isle. So I'm now the
Which
lead
game?
product-
I'm sorry.
Treasure Isle.
Treasure Island.
So I run the product management group for that game. When we first started, it was actually a small team of devs, a really great game designer, Mark Skaggs, who was the designer of Farmville, and Amit, who was the developer of Farmville, and I was a single PM, and I was surprised first joining Zynga at just how much pure design there was involved. Obviously, we wanted to make a game in the treasure genre, but there was a million decisions that we made just on instinct alone, which ultimately proved correct. For example,
Instinct. That's hardly measurable.
it is. It ultimately, when we launched the game, at least Mark's instincts were definitely confirmed through the success of that game. And post-launch, what happened is we staffed up the product management group. We now have 7 people as PMs on this game, and we're just analyzing, crunching numbers, trying to drive revenue, trying to drive growth. But post-launch is basically very much an artistic, instinctual design process. Pre-launch, sorry.
No, that's great. So Laura, more art than science for you. Do you have any kind of tips for how you would get started with building a great web startup around design?
I do. I think that one thing, we keep talking about how some of these artistic decisions aren't testable. I think they're not testable through quantitative means, but you can get a lot of value testing qualitatively. And when I say, I always have to hesitate when I say, user tests or asking people how they like something, because I think people take that to mean that you're just going to turn over everything. As Eric said, we're just going to turn over everything to the user and they're just going to design our product for us. That's not what I mean. I mean that when you have sort of this artistic vision for your product, it's actually much faster and much cheaper to create mock-ups of that, to create interactive prototypes of that, to create different versions of it and get it in front of people and watch them use it. See what they like and what they don't like. See what they respond to and what they don't respond to. Just get their impressions of it and then understand why they feel that way. At that point, that's sort of when it becomes magic or art. That I feel like is science. You watch people use it, you analyze their responses, you see what they're responding to. At that point, it becomes a little bit more art, a little bit more magic, saying, okay, now I know these things. How do I change their reactions to it? What can I do? What can I change about my product to make it more appealing, to make it easier to use, to solve their problems? And then you do several rounds of that until you're getting the response that you want from people in your qualitative testing. And then once you launch it, then you go and you look at your metrics and you figure out if you made the right decision. And then that turns into a feedback loop as well, right? Once you've integrated qualitative design and quantitative, you can actually start to really improve your design process because you can say, I made this decision last time and the metrics really didn't bear it out. The metrics really didn't show that I made the right decision there. So let's figure out what I did wrong.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, I think, and I'm going to ask Siku a question too about this, is that I think that a better term for art might just be qualitative. That might be a better way to describe it, because I think in the way that if you're going to build a game at Zynga, I imagine that all those little decisions you're making, that fits some sort of model of what you guys think is actually fun or not fun, and it is kind of like you're building a hypothesis around it. Now it happens to be that it's qualitative or it's based on prior experience or whatever. But it is still scientific. It's just not directly measurable.
Yeah, so it is definitely driven by experience. It's not random decisions thrown out there. It is based on experience of people. The 31 million people playing Farmville every day. So when I think back about the pre-launch process of Treasure Isle, the game itself, the game design, the feel of it was a series of hundreds, thousands of tiny decisions that make up the game. What I spent the better part of a month on exclusively was the first 5 to 10 minutes of that experience. And that is something you can get qualitative feedback on. And I like to plug, I'm unpaid sponsor of this service, but It is the most valuable thing that I've used in the past year. It's called usertesting.com. And what that is for $39. It used to be $29. It's $39